communication classes always teach you to lead an interaction with a positive, positive first impressions, all that kind of stuff. So let's lead today off with a negative. The first hour I spent with Resident Evil Village was the most frustrating hour of gaming I've ever had. The game barely ran on my new PC. Once the action started, it was a tanked experience. I stopped before reaching 2 hours and got my money back, which, thanks Steam, but I'm now forever out of my pre-order bonuses and have lived ever since with the fear of running any new PC game. I probably could have fixed the performance problems by messing around with drivers or blaming DRM or something, but with Steam's 2-hour return window, I wasn't going to play around with my PC gaming incompetence. That was my first impression of the game, and while I ended up playing the game many times with no performance issues on PS4, it established Resident Evil Village in my mind as a game where everything was just slightly off. The story, the gunplay, the enemy design, the difficulty balancing, and inventory system all felt off, ever so subtly, to produce an experience not as polished as the previous Resident Evil 7, or as mechanically satisfying as Resident Evil 4, the game Village is desperately trying to be. The lack of a general consensus around Village and my own conflicted feelings make it ripe for some video action. Now that I'm in a post-hype and post-sad state, let's take a look at Resident Evil Village 1 year later. Resident Evil Village continues the story of Ethan Winters, the guy from Resident Evil 7. From a story perspective, one of the larger hurdles Village has to negotiate is that Ethan's defining characteristic is that he's the guy from Resident Evil 7. RE7 was something of a hard reset for the series. It wanted to create a more personal and immersive horror experience that had never really been a part of the series before. Part of that process was creating a main character that wouldn't overshadow the player. Ethan Winters fits that need perfectly, as he's a mostly personality-free container for the player to experience the Baker's Nightmare House. Village, on the other hand, has a much larger story than 7. It's a story that connects to the larger Resident Evil narrative and centers Ethan as an important part of that story. Despite his newfound importance, Ethan needs to remain general enough to allow players to vicariously experience the story, the thrills, and even the chills. Being a fish out of water helped Ethan achieve this emptiness in 7, and this role is something Village takes so seriously that it undermines its own narrative to protect it. Village begins with Ethan living in Eastern Europe, with Mia and his newborn daughter, Rose. Despite his life being upended by RE7, Ethan's new life is, at the very least, somewhat normal, and he gets to resume life as the everyman. That is until Chris Redfield drives a car through Ethan's front door, shoots Mia in the head multiple times, and forces Ethan and Rose into a black truck. I'm not gonna lie, I'm a sucker for some Resident Evil soap opera antics, and this opening got me intrigued. The scale is much smaller than the globe-trotting twists of Resident Evils 5 and 6, and this familial massacre at the hands of a beloved character creates an intimate setup that works. Well, kind of. We'll talk more about that later. But at least initially, it works quite well. While this early explosion of mayhem and drama can be summarized by Tim Allen grunting, it keeps Ethan's conflict simple and identifiable. The black truck Ethan got stuffed into crashes, and Ethan finds himself stranded in a werewolf-infested village where he needs to find his daughter. Dude Bro looking for his daughter in a derelict town is a strong and basic everyman setup that works to keep Ethan grounded as a surrogate for the player. There are a couple lines throughout the game that say Ethan received military training after the events of 7, but that mostly serves as hand-waving to explain away the more absurd set pieces. Outside of these absurd moments, Ethan plays and talks closer to a generic person, and it's easier to vicariously relate to the fantasy of saving your daughter from a crazy cult than it is to save the president's daughter from a crazy cult. Leon in Resident Evil 4 is a one-man army machine gunning, roundhouse kicking, and one-lining his way through all of rural Spain on a super-secret covert op. Ethan is just a dork who just so happens to be both skilled enough and lucky enough to survive an exciting horror action story. While Ethan's basis is as a blank slate for the player to mold, it doesn't mean there's no character here. What surprised me on replay was just how much I ended up liking Ethan as a protagonist, at least relative to where my opinion was before. In the quest for universalism, Capcom concealed Ethan's face in pre-release art, despite him having a face in 7. This reinforces Ethan's role as an infinitely fungible character to suit each player. But as the game goes on, and the quest to save Rose becomes more desperate, Ethan actually begins to develop. In 7, Ethan basically never went beyond his "whoa, this is messed up" phase, and remained a vessel to experience the Baker family, who were the real main characters of 7. In Village, though, Ethan goes a little wild. Early on, he's still very much in the whoa dude camp, while everyone else does the business of being interesting, but he eventually starts dropping cringe one-liners and getting salty with the villains.
In death as he was in life. Disgusting.
Hey, come on, man. At least say something like, I thought he could do better. I said that using Ethan was the game's largest hurdle, and overall, I do think that the game succeeded. It is a remarkable testament to how much nothing Ethan was that even the most minor depictions of personality or growth are a significant positive.
Fuck you, you crazy bitch!
But by the time the credits roll, Ethan's intense sacrifice to save Rose struck me. Not in a highly specific way, but in the broader, more general emotions of sympathy and nobility. Sure, the depiction of fatherhood here is not nearly as deep or intricate as God of War or The Last of Us, but compared to the rest of Resident Evil, Ethan's simple personal life is by far the most engaging character journey in the franchise. Bizarrely enough, it's only rivaled by Barry Burton in Revelations 2. However, at the end of the game, Ethan's one-liners and vague design more or less make him the I had to do it to him guy. Village, despite its more personal conceit, slots right in with Resident Evil tradition. Resident Evil has almost universally focused on camp. Unlike its psychological rival Silent Hill, the Resident Evil series has always been something of a horror soap opera. Even its stronger thematic elements, such as the lunacy of corporatized military projects, share a strong lineage with films like The Stuff. Camp is the wheelhouse, it's the bread and butter, and Village does, for the most part, nail this tone. The decision to focus on folklore monsters gives Village a wider palette to work with. Resident Evil stories have always embraced camp, primarily through their sicko villains and weirdo side characters. Since most of the games have focused on hordes of brainless monsters, it's usually isolated to one or two characters per game. Barry Burton, Wesker, Chief Ironside, and Leon, to name a few. Because most bosses are fought as brainless entities like Birkin, Mr. X, Tyrant, and Plant 42, they often serve as one-off moments where they get to be wacky or let a pre-existing character be wacky. RE7 realized that making bosses cognizant gave them more life and opportunities to interact with each other and the player. The Baker Dinner by itself creates a more engaging group of antagonists than any previous game had. The problem is that all the Bakers were essentially the same, humans with various mold powers. In most contexts, that would not be a problem, but Resident Evil is nothing if not a series of excess. The folklore monsters in Village let the villains not only be self-aware, existential beings like the Bakers, but also have a wide variety. We get vampires, succubi, freaky fish guys, puppeteers, werewolves, ascended mold goddesses, and alchemists. It's all over the place. But, as we'll see later, this variety allows for a dynamic range of gameplay scenarios. But in terms of narrative, it means we get a constant flow of fun and interesting villains for Ethan to deal with. 7 more or less lost narrative steam once the Bakers were left behind. Village never suffers that same fate, because the colorful cast is spread across the game. When Ethan first reaches the village, you get a brief stroll through hell. This lost but not forgotten hero gives Ethan some heat, and after some lucky escapes, Ethan finds himself captured by the 4 lords of the village. This freak show menagerie carries the entire game. The first hour of Village establishes the motivation for Ethan, the village as a setting, and the monsters running the show. Unlike 7, we never stray from this core group. When each of them is knocked off, the game is over. It's simple, and frankly an obvious structure, but it's a great boon of Village's pacing. Outside of a late game section where you play as Chris, the game is always sharply focused on these villains. Each lord serves as a box for Ethan to check off in his quest to save Rose, and each one is a fully fleshed out wackadoo. The elegant and bloodthirsty Lady D, the simpfish Moreau, and the rebellious inventor Heisenberg operate as major area bosses and characters that haunt their areas, whether as nemesis-style enemies or as taunting monstrosities. The only lord that doesn't have a particularly strong presence is the puppeteer Beneviento, as her section serves primarily as a walking simulator set piece. Other than the amusing barking that the lords do at one another and at Ethan, the greatest asset the lords provide is how they set the visual design of each major area. Lady D's castle is brilliantly adorned, richly elegant and refined on the surface. Expensive vases, paintings, drawing rooms, and foyers decorate the castle. However, deep below are the catacombs and dungeons filled with blood wine and the corrupted remains of dead and forgotten servants. Beneviento's house is a waking nightmare, where Ethan is pulled by strings through a demented nightmare funhouse. Moreau's flooded bay is filled with rickety docks, mossy coves, and straining electrical circuits that look like they could fray at any moment. Heisenberg's mad factory is filled with mechanical monstrosities and the sickening labs fusing man and metal. Structurally, this is not much different from Resident Evil's typical flow of large house, small house, lab loop, and the heightened differences between each area give a feeling closer to Mario's Grassland, Iceland, Fireland progression. Despite how extreme it all is, this is easily Resident Evil's most fully realized world. What grounds all these desperate areas and makes the whole of Village feel cogent is the titular village itself. The rotting township serves as a hub world of sorts that Ethan explores more of each time he finishes a major area. The village is a winding set of streets, houses, farms, wells, and madness that progress linearly, but in a way that wraps around itself to open up the way forward in new secrets and small stories about the villagers who once liked the place, but aren't liking it so much anymore. For story, Village is the peak for Resident Evil in terms of lucidity of location and character drive. However, and it's a big however, and a big but, the game has a critical, major flaw in its structure that cheapens the whole experience. At the beginning of the game, Chris blows away Mia. As I mentioned earlier, this sets up a mystery and shocks the player, and it works well enough at first, but it ultimately is just a cheap shock. Chris doesn't explain anything to Ethan at this point. Eventually, Chris explains that the reason he didn't tell Ethan anything is because he knew Ethan would want to get involved. Even for meathead Chris Redfield, this is a shockingly stupid explanation that only makes sense in that it's a decision to artificially create shock and mystery. This structure undermines the game severely by creating an unnecessary red herring with Chris and caking the entire setup with an unnecessary layer of stupid. Not the kind of stupid that uplifts Resident Evil, but the kind of stupid that frustrates a story's pacing. The most baffling part is that Capcom could have had their cake with the shock opening and eaten it too with some small tweaks. After Chris takes Ethan and Rose, we could have just had a cutscene where Chris tries to explain, "Hey Ethan, that wasn't Mia. The real Mia has been kidnapped and we know her location. We're gonna get you and Rose to safety." And then blam, car explodes, Ethan gets separated from Chris and the game proceeds as normal. Ethan gets to be involved by circumstance, the mystery is intact, Chris isn't a bait and switch, and the game no longer has to account for Mount Stupid. Because ultimately, if Chris didn't want Ethan to get involved, he shouldn't have machine gunned his wife and, kidnapped his daughter without explaining anything. Because if there's one thing that's going to get anyone involved, it's a no-context murder kidnapping. I don't tend to like this kind of story critique. It can often be shallow and descend into CinemaSins territory. Besides, characters, like people, sometimes do monumentally stupid things. Sometimes, however, there is a line, and Village crosses it. I guess beginning with a dumb decision befits Village. The white whale for Village is Resident Evil 4. It wants so desperately to be like RE4, and that too is a game that begins with a bizarre, dumb decision. In RE4, the president's daughter is kidnapped, and instead of a team of elite operatives, the US government sends in one wisecracking white dude with an emo cut. But that type of dumb fits. It's the Snake Plissken approach. Get one cool dude to go in and solve the problem. It's a simple action trope that acknowledges that we're here for a good time, and it's the type of silly decision-making that doesn't distract from character motivation or artificially create false storylines. Village's opening stupid feels slightly off, unlike RE4, and that's a through line that runs through the gameplay. When I first played Village, I found that everything played a little off. The guns and shooting are a little too clunky. The enemies are a little too tanky and dodgy. The difficulty balancing as a whole just never felt right. Old school Resident Evil enemies were generally weak, with most of the common enemies of the classic games and the action trilogy of 4, 5, and 6 being punching bags made threatening by either volume or a limit on resources. The Renaissance era of Resident Evil has taken influence from the GameCube's Resident Evil 0 and Remake. Individual enemies in the new games are powerhouses on their own. This design is at its zenith in the Resident Evil 2 remake, where individual zombies can take upwards of 20 handgun shots to go down for good. For horror-focused games, this approach works. Resources always feel tight, and in the new games, it motivates the player to find alternate strategies to navigate levels. Village enemies follow this principle, but as well as being tanky, many of the enemies, especially the Lycans, are dodgy, able to juke bullets with their advanced lateral movement. Big, fast, and Bullet Sponge describes basically every enemy in the game except for the lowly zombies, and even then, those weak enemies really only lack in speed. On standard difficulty, the enemies for the most part play fine. The Lycans can be annoying as they sidestep headshots, but ammo and crafting resources are plentiful enough to never be a concern. Easy and normal both work well enough, but the holes in the game's enemies and encounter design appear on Hardcore and Village of Shadows, the meme difficulty. Village wants to be the action-packed diesel truck that RE4 was, so there's more bosses, more enemies, and bigger guns. The issue is the controls play about the same as RE7. There is slightly more fluidity in aiming and significantly more options, but the enemies have been sped up and bulked up beyond what RE7 systems could handle. Hardcore enemies eat way more headshots than they did in 7 Madhouse, and it frustrates the experience when action is supposed to be more active than terrifying. The highest difficulties of RE4, 7, and 2 Remake enhance the experiences. The mechanics are balanced around the highest difficulties, and the dance of monsters and bullets is elevated at the higher levels. Village is balanced around maximum carnage, but there's no synergy between Ethan and the enemies to make the game feel as desperately aggressive as it should be. There is a caveat worth mentioning though. Early on, during the obligatory seed section, the player is introduced to flour sacks. Shooting them blows flour in the faces of enemies, temporarily blinding them. In terms of balancing, the Lycans being these tanky monsters you need to crowd control and stealth around would make sense. However, the flour is generally rare, and stealth isn't a developed mechanic. It means you either have sections where you need to fight the Lycans, or sections where the easiest method is to just run past everything. Neither is particularly satisfying, since the shooting mechanics are clunky and simplistic, while running past enemies is too easy and lacks the planning that enemy dodging had in older Resident Evil games. Aside from the slow aiming speed letting Ethan get juked like crazy, the guns are weirdly balanced around one another. The handguns, even when fully upgraded, are often pea shooters. Even on normal mode, some enemies can survive being mag dumped from the handguns. The shotguns and sniper rifle are, by comparison, extremely powerful and can one-shot enemies that the pistols are mag dumping. This gun balancing is not uncommon in the series, but what makes it feel worse is how the handguns have such low utility in a game this combat heavy. In RE4 and 5, the handgun's precision allowed it to effectively crowd control, since you could get enemies to fall or stagger with leg and headshots. Same for RE7's Not a Hero DLC. In RE2 and 3 remakes, pistols could kneecap enemies and stagger them to make them easier to dodge. The pistol has never had the raw power of shotguns, rifles, or magnums, but they've always had good utility. In Village, enemies stagger the same way they did in 4, but this is rarely useful the way that it was in the previous games. The stagger windows are quite small and don't give any contextual melee options. Headshots, especially on Lycans, are risky to go for since they're so fast, and the benefits of blowing weapons out of the enemy hands is often not worth the trouble. There is one niche that the pistol still feels, and it's a weird one. On the PS5 version, which I played for this video, each gun plays differently with the adaptive triggers. The pistol controls normally, while the shotgun requires more pressure to shoot and the rifle requires a bunch of pressure to aim. The adaptive triggers are one of the coolest parts of the PS5, but it's a mixed bag with Village. They make each gun feel more tactile, it's immersive, and in 2022, it's still novel. But it also makes the gunplay clunkier in a game whose aiming and shooting needs to be ever so slightly smoothed out. As an action game, Village would play better if Lycan juking was slowed down, aiming was sped up, staggering was made more useful, or stealth were better implemented. It's a bunch of minor tweaks that would have made the game more satisfying. Again, these issues are not really present on normal or easy, where enemy health and damage output are more properly scaled. For me though, it's hard to turn off the hard mode brain for a series that I've always been bat crazy in when it comes to hard modes. I debated whether or not to talk about Village of Shadows. It's an obvious troll difficulty designed for New Game Plus. It's only unlocked after clearing the game once, and it's mostly a playground for the infinite ammo, magnums, and machine guns. Played on a new game file, Village of Shadows is terrible, but like Nightmare and RE3 Remake, it's also not meant to be played that way. On paper though, VOS does do some interesting things. It does all the basic stuff, more enemy health, more enemy damage, and more enemies in general. With the pre-existing conditions of enemies already being too dodgy and tanky, it makes combat not worth it, except for the fact that enemy drops are significantly greater than on the other difficulties. Enemies drop rare treasures and piles of cash in VOS that make the trade-off between resource expenditure and enemy drops much more interesting than if the money values were left the same. On normal mode, enemies will drop around $200 to $500, but drops can be over $2,000 in Village of Shadows. This change doesn't make VOS fun, as even on New Game Plus it brings out the worst in the game, but at least it's interesting.
I don't want to die.
I'm sick of bugs.
This is because money's back, and better than ever. Instead of the merchant of old, Ethan's weapons dealer is the Duke, a mysterious and quite fun character that hooks Ethan up with new guns, weapon upgrades, and other such sundries. I actually think that the weapon upgrade system in Village is massively improved from RE4. In that game, I never upgraded anything until I had the final weapon I wanted in each class. That was because certain weapon properties like the shotgun knockback or the handgun stunning ability weren't tied to upgrades, and ammo is never a scarce resource. In Village, ammo can get quite scarce, especially for the shotgun, so upgrading the power and timing the ammo capacity upgrades became central to resource management. Whereas in RE4, it was very easy to hoard cash and bankroll stupid amounts of upgrades in the mid-game. There's also fewer guns overall, so new guns often don't become available until after completing major areas, further pressuring upgrades. It also happens that upgrades tend to progress linearly with the next gun in a class. An upgraded Lemmy is less powerful than the base M1911, and an upgraded M1911 is less powerful than the base V61 Custom. Since sell price of weapons increases based on upgrades, upgrading the weak weapons never feels like a long-term waste, and getting the newer weapons never feels like you're wasting previous investments. Another major purchase Ethan makes from the Duke is increased inventory space. Tetris briefcase is back, and it's another area where Village just feels slightly off. In the entirety of my last run of Village, I rearranged the inventory a single time, and never had to do any inventory crunch. I never ran out of space, and didn't even upgrade the case all the way. Of course, I'm an experienced player who's played the game multiple times, and I generally use my resources more freely than most, but I've still almost never interacted with the inventory in any playthrough. In RE4, the briefcase acted as an anti-hoarding incentive. Since there was no way to bank extra items, those healing herbs, eggs, grenades, and ammo stacks might as well be used since there's no saving up. The high-powered mines and pipe bombs in Village stack, unlike the grenades in 4. Crafting materials don't take up any inventory space like herbs did in 4. It means that the inventory works like Silent Hill, where you just have enough space for pretty much everything all the time. This isn't a bad thing, but it makes the inventory a mechanical feature that never has to be engaged with. If I wanted to make the briefcase more engaging, I'd probably make the crafting materials take up space to force players to actually use them. It's easy to run through the game and only craft based on need at any given time. Metal and rusted scrap pile up, and there's no pressure to plan out your usage. It's a purely reactive system that would benefit from the depth the inventory system could bring it. The actual mechanics of the inventory itself make it seem like the developers didn't even spend much time on it. One of the quality of life features in RE4 was that when you were rearranging items, laying an item on top of another would automatically pick up the overlapped item. It made the inventory quick and easy, but that feature isn't in Village. Every move is individual, and it makes it a bit of a slog on the rare occasions you need to navigate the inventory. While that might be a minor and fairly petty point, I think it's perfectly illustrative of the problems that Village has. The game is gorgeous, the environments are richly detailed, the villains are fun and engaging, but on the gameplay side, everything is slightly unpolished. It's all ticks and degrees off of brilliant, and 1 year after release, Village is the biggest cock tease of the Resident Evil series. But you know, I know me. I can call this game a disappointment, I can call its Chris setup frustrating, but I'll probably play it a bunch more times before the next remake or Resident Evil 9. If that's not a comment on the game's overall quality, then I don't know what is. Or maybe it says something about me. Who can say for sure.